We all know that strikes help people win better pay and working conditions. But did you know they also helped bring down slavery? From football pundits to bus drivers, it's fair to say that workers withdrawing their labour is pretty big news at the moment.
Sports presenters boycotted Saturday's programmes in support of Gary Lineker.
Out of the classroom and onto the picket line.
The largest nursing strike in NHS history.
Border force strikes might not end for months.
If you were to believe the government,
the travelling public are being held ransom by militant unions.
You'd think that strikes have been invented by villainous trade union barons to inconvenience you and bring society to a standstill.
I do mind being called a baron. I'm an elected officer of this union.
At best, they're the actions of a greedy minority of workers who don't care about anything other than lining their own pockets. And at worst, they're a malevolent and undemocratic force holding the country back from progress.
And we've got to keep Britain moving by making it harder to have strikes that bring the nation to a halt.
Even if you're someone who's generally supportive of strike action, you probably think of them as being relatively modern. Trade unions from the 19th century onwards, organising for better pay. But if you were to look back through human history, you'd see that the collective withdrawal of labour has been the most powerful tool we've had in building a more civilised society. Strikes have had a long and global history, and they're about so much more than just wages. The first ever recorded strike took place over 3,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. Tomb builders and artisans downed tools in Deir el-Medina after the system of payment broke down and their wages were 18 days late. They marched on the city of Thebes. Local officials, at a loss for any other ideas, tried to mollify the workers by ordering them pastries. It didn't work. The strike continued for months after multiple rounds of failed negotiations and false promises to resolve the back pay problem. Workers blocked off access to the Valley of the Kings, meaning that priests couldn't make offerings to the dead, and when armed guards turned up and threatened to remove the men by force, one striker responded that he would damage the royal tombs if they took another step. Hardcore shit. In the end, the workers won, and their actions at Deir el-Medina changed the face of labour disputes in ancient Egypt forever. Workers realised they had power if they collectively refused to work. It was the first recorded strike in the New Kingdom, but it most certainly was not the last. If you're a big ol' nerd, you might have read the Lysistrata, a comedy play by Aristophanes where the women of Sparta and Athens organise a sex strike in order to bring the Peloponnesian War to an end. But sex strikes actually happened. In pre-colonial times, Igbo women in southern Nigeria would organise sex strikes in response to poor treatment at the hands of men. Women would form themselves into a kind of trade union, headed up by the Agba Ekwe, a woman believed to be the earthly manifestation of a goddess, and withdraw from all domestic and sexual labour until their demands were met. In more recent years, sex strikes have been called in Iceland, Liberia, Kenya, Colombia, and the Philippines. And look, while their actual effectiveness should probably be taken with a pinch of salt, feminist activists have noted that even the threat of a sex strike does wonders for attracting media coverage for issues that would otherwise go totally ignored. The slaves freed themselves. That was the great observation and provocation of W.E.B. Du Bois. People enslaved by the transatlantic trade weren't just sitting around waiting for William Wilberforce to show up. Across the colonies and continental North America, they were fighting for their own liberation. Enter, stage left, the strike. In 1831, 60,000 slaves led by the Deacon Samuel Sharp went on strike in Jamaica, demanding a working wage and their freedom. Their demands were refused, and the strike escalated into outright rebellion. What became known as the Baptist War was the largest slave uprising in the British West Indies. It was brutally suppressed by the British, and the death toll was horrific. But the scale of the uprising and the disruption caused by the strike helped make slavery an economically unappealing institution in the eyes of the ruling class. And just a few years later, in 1834, slavery was abolished in the British Empire. But the role of the strike in abolishing slavery doesn't end there. W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction argues that the American Civil War really ought to be viewed as a general strike. The mass escape of black slaves from Confederate plantations and their joining of the Union Army fatally weakened the southern plantations and strengthened the northern cause. And many of those who couldn't flee the South participated in labour stoppages which hamstrung the Confederate cause. If they were seeking peace and quiet, wrote Du Bois, they were much better off on the plantations than trailing in the footsteps of the army or squatting miserably in the camps. They were mistreated by the soldiers, ridiculed, driven away, and yet they came. They increased with every campaign, and as a final gesture, they marched with Sherman from Atlanta to the sea and met the refugees and abandoned human property on the Sea Islands and the Carolina coast. This was not merely the desire to stop work. It was a strike on a wide basis against the conditions of work. It was a general strike that involved directly, in the end, perhaps 500,000 people. They wanted to stop the economy of the plantation system, and to do that, they left the plantations. So strikes aren't just the preserve of workers formerly organised in trade unions, they helped create the very category of the free worker as we know it today. We tend to think of strikes happening when workers want to achieve something that's in their own interests, like better pay or conditions. But the 1862 Lancashire Mill Workers' Strike was the exact opposite. It was workers going on strike, even though it meant facing starvation and destitution, all in order to help bring down slavery in the United States. At the time, Lancashire alone imported 3/4 of all cotton grown on southern plantations. So when Abraham Lincoln enacted a cotton embargo, its textile industry was brought to its knees. With 60% of spins and looms stopped, vast numbers of Lancashire's textile workers were left without work. Rioting broke out as people were plunged into poverty and many went hungry. Despite the fact it was against their own economic interests, still the Lancashire mill workers refused to touch slave-picked cotton. The Lancashire mill workers had never been to the United States. Few, if any, would have ever even met an enslaved person. But they were motivated by a powerful sense of justice. At a meeting at the Manchester Free Trade Hall, the workers reaffirmed their commitment to the cotton embargo, saying that they recognised the common brotherhood of mankind and the sacred and inalienable right of every human being to personal freedom and equal protection. The actions of the Lancashire mill workers fly in the face of how we conventionally think about strikes. It wasn't about their own pay, it wasn't about their own conditions, and it was against their own financial interests. It was an act of self-sacrifice and solidarity to advance the rights and freedoms of people they'd never even set eyes on. So why is this important? The last few decades have seen the introduction of hugely restrictive anti-trade union laws, all intended to make it harder to go on strike.
The government took aim at striking ambulance teams today.
Ambulance workers and firefighters could be banned from going on strike.
MPs have backed anti-strike legislation which is aimed at enforcing minimum service levels for some sectors during strikes. It's cleared the Commons, but not without criticism.
And across the board, that's had a massively corrosive impact on equality.
You work in a business? Do you want some fruit? I'm homeless.
We see that in terms of the distribution of wealth. The workers' share that they take home in wages has declined relative to profit and asset wealth. Conditions have become more precarious with the growth of zero-hours contracts and outsourcing.
I've been on 3 different zero-hours contracts in different cities. I've never been able to make ends meet.
But as well as that, our ability to make society fairer and more just has been gutted.
The income gap in the UK is the largest it's been in 10 years. So now we live in a world where food bank use has almost doubled since 2014. Yeah. Nearly a third of low-income families are unable to heat their home. Meanwhile, the richest 1% of households in the UK are worth around £3.6 million each.
By presenting strikes as just being about our own pay, our own conditions, we lose sight of the fact that they're the best weapon we have against elite interests. And that's why they want to stop us from doing it.